Good evening, welcome to the August 17th update on the tropics here. We have two systems to talk about. Fred is still impacting the southeast United States here, and unfortunately we've had a rather significant tornado outbreak and some pretty significant flash flooding reported in the Carolinas, so thoughts go out to those people that are being affected by that system currently, but due to the fact that we can't really forecast much on that system, we are not going to be talking about it since it is already inland and most of the impacts have already occurred. We still have two systems to talk about, nonetheless. We have Tropical Storm Grace here now just exiting Jamaica. It may still be on the island of Jamaica, but it's very close to getting off of the island of Jamaica. And then we have very small Tropical Storm Henri here, centered to the south of Bermuda, that has strengthened somewhat overnight and throughout the day today, and it is currently in question about how strong this will be able to get over the next few days. I did make a mistake in yesterday's video, and we'll talk about that in more detail later, but I did say that Henri would contribute to the strengthening of the mid-level ridge that is steering Grace, and that is not true because both entities here, you have the upper level trough that you're kind of seeing here, generally with more convective activity now associated with this upper level trough that is going to be moving into the area that the ridge is currently established. You can't really see the ridge here, but it is established and building off to the north of Grace, and both of these entities should actually push against this ridge because Henri is expected to continue off to the southwest and west, really more off to the west here, and so those should kind of squeeze the ridge, but we'll talk about that more in detail when we talk about Henri and the overall steering pattern for Grace. So anyway, let's get right into this with Grace. Here we are with Grace, and you can tell a few things just by looking at visible satellite. One, the system is much better defined than it was yesterday. There is very obviously a center of circulation, and the circulation has become much more potent and much larger, and so it is beginning to be able to pull from more areas. You can see inflow into the system being pulled well away from the system's circulation, and hence that banding is beginning to set up on the western side. You can see some bubbling convection and increasing symmetry overall with the system's cloud pattern and convective pattern, and that should continue as the negative effects of a trough continue to wane. If we look at the water vapor loop here, you can see what we're talking about with a little bit of convective asymmetry here. You can see that most of the convection is still weighted onto the east side, but you can see that generally this is more symmetrical. You have, the center is right around here, and you can see that a convection is beginning to expand off to the west, indicating that the trough's negative effects are fading. And another indication that the trough is still there but is beginning to lose ground is that outflow is beginning to expand off to the northwest just a little bit, not too much, and this really should accelerate over the next couple of days as the trough continues to get pushed back by the storm's upper level outflow. You can see the outflow beginning to expand rather quickly off to the north and northeast here. You can see it really expanding off to the northeast here. So this is definitely in a much more favorable environment than it has been over the past couple of days, and you can see that the upper level cloud field of the system is rather large at this point and should continue to be very large, and it's very hard to see that this system does not strengthen over the next couple of days. Now, if we go back to the visible loop here, you can see that we definitely have a well-defined mid-level circulation that is stacked with the lower-level circulation somewhere on the western tip or just off the western tip of Jamaica. But the pace of intensification over the next couple of days needs to be really pinned down, is going to really depend on how organized the inner core of the system and when the system can even organize an inner core, because it is starting to show signs of an ascent inner core here. You can see bands of heavy convection here somewhere around this general area. You can see it's starting to wrap around just a little bit. It's not very well organized just yet, but you generally want to see, if you want a core to really develop here, you want wrapping bands of convection curling around a center here, and that has begun. It is not very far into that process yet, but it should be recovering as it comes off of the coast of Jamaica here within the next hour or so. But during that time between now and whenever it organizes an inner core, depending on how much time that does take, will result in how much time it is able to have over water to strengthen at a faster pace. So that came out weird, but pretty much the longer it takes to organize an inner core, the shorter amount of time it's going to have to really quickly strengthen, because there's not going to be much in the way of the system as we get further along in the system's trek through the Western Caribbean. If we look at the 24-hour GFS here, you can see what we're talking about with the trough here being practically dissolved at this point. There's really not a whole lot in the way of shear at this point out of the system, and you can see that the upper level anticyclone of the system is very well defined and is pushing away at this trough, and this trough essentially disappears here as this makes landfall near the Yucatan Peninsula. Due to the fact that the storm is so south now and is now passing over Jamaica rather than, we were talking about a couple days ago how it could have gone north of Hispaniola, it could have gone over Cuba. Well, now it's gone over Jamaica, and so that allows for the Yucatan Peninsula to be in play now, and more so than it was even yesterday. So if you're along the Yucatan Peninsula, you do have hurricane warnings up now. But really, where this organization of a core occurs, it's very finicky. It's very small in terms of error, but it does, due to the fact that there is a difference in the angle of approach here, if it comes off the north coast of Jamaica versus the central coast, it's a very small error. It's really not too much. It'll end up being somewhere in this area where the system makes landfall. But you can see, if we go back to talking about the upper level environment here, you can see very clearly that there is not much in the way of shear here, and the system has a very well-defined bubble of upper level anticyclonic outflow here over the system, which allows for strengthening as the system comes westward. And you can see this even better in the H-Wharf model here. This is also 24 hours. You can see that the H-Wharf has a little stronger of a system than the GFS has, but you can see why that is the case, as there's not really a whole lot in the way of shear here. You have a very well-defined outflow channel coming out of the system, both on the north side and on the southern side here. And as a result, the system, as it advances off to the west, is able to strengthen and intensify all the way up until landfall upon the Yucatan Peninsula. And this does not bode well for the island of Cozumel or Cancun, but really it depends on where exactly this makes landfall as to who gets the core. But regardless, if you're on the Yucatan Peninsula, you have probably a little less than 2 days now before the system hits your area. And of course now the northwestern coast of Mexico definitely needs to be on full alert, as if we continue into the trek over the Bay of Campeche and the Gulf of Mexico here, you can see that the environment is even more favorable, as we have a slightly displaced upper-level anticyclone over the system, but you do still have very well-defined outflow channels and clouds generally coming out of the system. You can see now that the upper-level anticyclone actually centers itself better over the system as it moves off to the west, and unfortunately for the northwest Mexican coast, this is a rather ideal environment for continued intensification. You can see that the upper level outflow enhances as the storm approaches the Mexican coast, especially off to the south. The equatorward outflow is very potent, and that is due to, if you look way over here, you can see an upper level low. This is the trough that is getting pushed by Henri. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is a trough that's being pushed by Henri's outflow, and you can see that an outflow jet is expanding out to the southeast of the system, which enhances all this flow that is coming out of the south of the system here that you're seeing in blue. And so, unfortunately, this is looking increasingly likely that this system could become a rather strong storm over the Bay of Campeche. We haven't really had a very powerful hurricane over the Bay of Campeche for a while. That last time that we had a really powerful hurricane over that in this general area of the Gulf of Mexico was Hurricane Carl back in 2010. We're talking specifically about this little area right here in the Gulf of Mexico where Grace is expected to pass. And the upper end of the intensity forecast, of course, is represented by the H-Wharf model here, which brings it all the way down to 948 millibars at landfall. But the general consensus on the intensity forecast in the National Hurricane Center shows this. If you look at the 5-day forecast from the National Hurricane Center that you see very clearly now there's hurricane warnings up for the northeast coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. You can see some weakening that occurs here, but they are expecting a hurricane to approach the northwest Mexican coast. This is near the Tampico area, but anywhere between Veracruz and north of Tampico really does need to be watching this. And this is a pretty set in stone forecast at this point. There's not really a whole lot of deviation that could occur. There's no, outside of the cone things that could happen here. There's not a whole lot in the way of the system gaining a ton of latitude. And if we look at the GFS model, 500 millibar forecast, you can see exactly why that is the case. You have the very strong ridge that we were talking about yesterday, and this ridge will continue to build in and move off to the west. And that is due to a couple of things. You have this trough here, way off to the north, and then you have Henri here building, and so that kind of squeezes the ridge down into the Gulf of Mexico here, and builds the westerly flow or the easterly flow over the system in the mid-levels, and pretty much bars the system from gaining any latitude. And the GFS actually has this ridge rather strong and pushes it even off to the southwest a little bit, and that is starting to be shown on the National Hurricane Center forecast track here. You can see a little bit of a dive off to the southwest here as the system makes landfall. We still have a little more than 3 days before the system makes its final landfall, but if you're in the northwest Mexican coast or near or north of the Tampico area and to the Veracruz area, you do need to be watching this and being very alert and listen to your local weather office. The Mexican Weather Service is definitely going to be doing the best it can to making sure that you guys are safe. So please stay tuned to them, and please stay tuned to the National Hurricane Center for all the latest information pertaining to Grace. This could be a rather bad hurricane for this region. Moving on, we have Tropical Storm Henri here to the south of Bermuda, and you can see that we have a much better defined, or better looking system today. We have a lot of outflow expanding out of the northern side of the system, indicating a very healthy system today. It is still dealing with a little bit of mid-level shear. You can see actually, if you look at the cloud tops that are coming out of the system off to the north, the mid-level shear is still pushing out of the north, and that is trying to disrupt the system a little bit. You did have a core develop for a time, and then it was disrupted by the mid-level shear. This is what we talked about yesterday about how a smaller storm is more easily affected by negative environmental aspects of the environment that is in, but you can see that the system is trying to develop a core once again. These new convective bursts will continue to fire around the low-level core, and that is due to the fact that the mid-level center might as well just be stacked over the lower-level center now. We were dealing with a system that was less stacked yesterday, and this has continued to overperform during the short-term forecast period, so this is definitely doing better than expected. And so as a result, the system, according to the National Hurricane Center, the forecast to be stronger in the short term. And now the National Hurricane Center forecasts a hurricane within the next couple of days here as this drifts generally off to the south and west here. This is not moving very fast, but it could pick up some speed as it deepens. And you can really see this on the GFS moisture field about what we're talking about with the mid-level shear continuing to increase. But due to the fact that the GFS now represents the system a little better and it is a little stronger, this is still lower than the actual intensity of the system now, because it is probably getting close to hurricane strength within the next 12 hours. It should be pretty knocking on hurricane strength door here. And you can see that the GFS moves us generally off to the west and west-southwest. But as the mid-level shear continues, the mid-level center is a little displaced from the lower level center. You can see the difference here. It's not very far anymore because the system is able to be stronger, and if it continues to overperform, we may not even see it weakened or hindered as much at all by the mid-level shear as the mid-level shear begins to grow upon the system. But it may not be too great for the system. It may be able to just level off rather than, strengthen. It's not going to be strengthening at all during this time frame. So as it advances off to the west and west-southwest here, this will continue to struggle with mid-level shear. But as it turns off to the north, it does enter a little more favorable of an environment because the mid-level flow switches from out of the north to out of the south, and that is more in line with the storm's motion. And so you can see on the GFS quickly here how the mid-level circulation begins to stack with the lower level circulation. Once again, we're still a few days out from this actually happening, so finicky changes in the forecast and what the GFS and what other models end up showing for the system do change. I want to show you the H-wharf as well for the better representation of the upper level environment. You can see the northerly flow generally coming out due to the fact that there is a trough that is an upper level ridge over the southeastern United States, and this is on the tail end of that. And you can see that Henri actually pushes. Remember how I said earlier that there was outflow coming from Henri that was pushing and creating this second branch of the trough. And if we actually go back to the GFS model here, you can see this outflow, and then immediately after the outflow here, you can see some cyclonic flow here, and that really presses this trough here. And as the system, you can see Grace really expands its outflow southward, but that is helped by this upper level low here, and this is partially due to the upper level flow or outflow that is being pushed out by Henri. And as we continue here, you can see this upper level trough set and shown very well on the H-wharf here. You can see this upper level trough, and this helps out both Grace and Henri. You have another trough here, also helping out Henri here. And so at this point in the forecast period, we're about 3 days, here we are, 3 days out, and you can see that Henri is centered under a very favorable upper level anticyclone, which would allow for significant strengthening of the system after this point and onward. And so if it survives and is able to maintain and potentially even, strengthen a little bit within the next 3 days, then it will be greeted with a very favorable upper level environment here as the flow in the upper level switches from out of the north to out of the south here off to the north of the system. And so this is now, according to the National Hurricane Center, forecast to strengthen into a hurricane after day 3 here and come off to the north and east after it makes this turn. And it really depends on where exactly this ends up. And there's a couple of finicky things that could occur with the system that may bring this a little closer to the northeast coast here. It is no longer really expected to be much of a deal for the southeast coast here, the Carolinas and mid-Atlantic here, but it could come uncomfortably close here to the New England coast and Canada. And the reason for that is, if we continue on the H-wharf model run, you can see there's a upper level trough here that is over the Great Lakes region, and you have flow that is beginning to turn back off to the north and potentially off to the northwest here. And you can see the trough is still here. This is more well shown in the mid-levels. If we actually look here, at the mid-level flow here, you can see this trough, and what Henri essentially would do, if it got far enough to the west, it would interact more with this trough. So at the distance that it's currently at, it would just kind of maybe nudge a little bit off to the north and then pass safely away from the coast. But if it's a little closer, say it's more right here than over here, then it would make a little more pronounced of a turn here. So essentially, what you're seeing right now on the H-Wharf run is the lesser part of the turn, and you can see it does turn a little bit off to the north, and then it'll continue off to the northeast after that point. But if it gets closer to the trough, then you may have a system that comes a little closer to the coast and has a little more of an impact here. And you can see that the system is large enough to where it doesn't actually have to be on shore in order for it to cause problems here, because as storms tend to gain latitude, they also tend to gain size due to the fact that they are becoming post-tropical during this time, or they're beginning their extratropical transition, even though it's well before they actually really get into that transition, but they do tend to gain latitude or gain size as they gain latitude. So if you're on the New England coast and if you're on the Canadian coast, do be watching this. This still has several days to evolve. We don't even know if this is actually going to be able to survive the mid-level flow, but it is very finicky, and it is looking increasingly likely that the system will be able to survive the only hurdle that it has to jump in its life. So please do be watching this as this does come off to the west and then off to the north. We'll go back to the true color loop and check out the overall Atlantic. Here we have our systems. Here's Henri, here's Grace, and we are still in the peak of the hurricane season. We're only going to be going up from here until September 10th, and you can see we have another wave here coming off. We have another wave also coming off, and the reason I'm showing these is because model support has generally picked up for something to come off the coast of Africa within the next few days. So be wary, be ready to have your hurricane kick in, ready to go. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching.